Well, here we are again. It's In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And for all those watching in the future, you're going to enjoy this. I'm with Florence Wilkinson tonight, and we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is urban nature, urban wildlife. And yeah, we'll be talking about that very shortly. But first, let me just quickly say that tonight is sponsored by our sponsors, and they are Leica Sport Optics and also CJ Wildlife, and they are a team of passionate nature lovers and experts in garden wildlife on a mission to make nature accessible for everyone. Whether you are a nature novice or garden guru, they want to inspire, educate, and provide the right tools to help wildlife thrive on your doorstep. So thank you very much, guys. So without any further ado, let's start tonight's proceedings. Let's talk about urban wildlife, which is, part of the reason why I'm here in the first place. How, by the way, how you guys have, what sort of week have you had, in terms of weekend, should I say? Have you been out watching urban wildlife? And in the future, if you're watching this in the future, what sort of time have you had watching urban wildlife? But anyway, Florence, hello, good evening. How are you and where are you?
Hello there. I'm good, thank you. I'm in my home, which is very urban, in between Camden and King's Cross, sort of about 5 minutes or so from all the new development in King's Cross in London, if anyone's aware of that.
What do you think of that? I mean, in my local patch, Wormwood Scrubs, it's kind of looking like Manhattan meets Croydon, and it's not a very nice hybrid. What's it like at your end?
Well, we've got a mix of different spaces and habitats around here. So the new developments in King's Cross and St Pancras are very shiny, but probably not very wildlife friendly. Although I have found a lot of rats, and I have actually been out looking for them. So, but I'm also within walking distance from Regent's Park, which has a lot of wildlife actually. And then the incredible Hampstead Heath, which is obviously a kind of fragment of ancient habitat, which has all sorts, as you know, because we've been up there together, I think.
That's right, yeah. What do you think about the architecture of today these days? Do you think that people are, I mean, this is just a visual sort of personal thing, not so much based on fact, but do you think that developers are kind of thinking more about wildlife, or are you just seeing sheer glass and steel buildings with no crevices or shelves or not shelves, ledges or anything like that on there?
Mm. I think that a lot of the development in King's Cross, a lot of the buildings probably aren't especially wildlife friendly. I think they are quite attractive. So we've got the gas holders where they've erected these old gas holder structures and then built these kind of circular blocks of flats in the middle that look incredible. They have made an effort kind of around and about. So I've actually spoken to the gardeners. There's some amazing landscaping around here. Not convinced of how wildlife friendly it is, but they don't use any pesticides whatsoever now, which is impressive. They've got lots of bug hotels and that kind of thing, and they have made the effort to put up swift boxes and that sort of thing. So there's a fair bit of that. I live in a kind of old 1980s housing estate, which is all quite low rise.
Funny how sorry to interrupt you, but it's funny how now how 1980s old.
Yeah, wow. Well, I was born in 1987, David. So, but yeah, we've got lots of in our estate, we've got lots of alleyways that have been sealed off because they used to be used for fairly nefarious things, still are the ones that are left open. And that means we get a lot of pipistrelle bats. And actually, despite the fact that you would expect most of them to be in hibernation, I saw a bunch of them yesterday. So that was a lot of fun. So they're still around and I see them foraging around the lampposts. Obviously, we've got a lot of foxes. We have jays on my estate. So we've got a decent amount, but in terms of architecture as well, we have just had an extension built to our little house, and I have had a green roof put on top, which I'm very excited about. So it already looks really nice and green, but come the spring, it should kind of bloom with wildflowers, and it should bloom all the way through into September. And the wood pigeons are already up there kind of picking at the clover seeds. So I'm really excited about that. Hope to see lots of pollinators up there and birds up there over the spring and summer.
Do you remember when we first met? I'm struggling to actually remember. Can you remind me?
Yeah, so I think I was trying to think about this before I jumped on this Zoom, but I think we met at an event in Camden to do with migration. Funnily enough, it was at a place called The Forge, because
Right.
my partner Ben and I ended up getting married there as our venue, and then it shut down. It went bankrupt straight
Well,
after we got married there. But yeah, so we met there at that event, I think.
well, at least it shut down after a great event.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah,
yeah, we were there, and then we kept in touch. I think you were speaking at the event, and I must have come up afterwards and had a chat with you.
yeah, actually, I can recall that now. But for those who don't know Florence, she is a writer, filmmaker, and a co-founder of the birdsong recognition app and citizen science project called Warbler, which we'll talk about tonight as well. And her work has been featured on the BBC, in the Telegraph, The Pool, Vice, and Gracia. That's what we say in Spain, Gracia. But that's
Yeah, grass, yeah.
her first book, which is a killer, is called Wild City. It's a journey into why we should engage with our fellow urban species, what we might see, and if we only take the time to look, and how nature is adapting to human engineered environments in unexpected and ingenious ways. And I've been looking through your book just to refresh myself, because I read it a while ago. And I find it interesting when you talk about the rise of the human city. Talk us through what the human city is about.
Well, I mean, I did a bit of research about this, and I was kind of trying to think about what a city actually is and where it came from, and kind of trace the roots of that. But I mean, I guess like you could start looking at a city in terms of a settlement when we first started to kind of settle in one spot, and not everyone agrees about this, but I think quite a few people put that in the sort of I think it's called the agrarian revolution type period. So when people learned to farm the land and to get enough food out of one piece of land, as opposed to moving around and having a nomadic lifestyle. And then I guess things became a bit more like cities when we started getting bits of infrastructure in place. So people started, I guess, kind of not just building dwellings, but creating roads and sharing transport and creating sort of communication links and that kind of thing. So you can go pretty far back. And I think you can, at the same time, perhaps trace the progress of certain commensal species like the house mouse or the house sparrow, which I thought was quite interesting.
It is interesting. And as a child, I remember, when I first started observing nature and reading the bird books of the time, and you had the impression that they're only found in wild places, and when they migrated, I just had this imagination that they kind of flew around cities or any urban sort of areas. They actively avoided humans. But then over time you kind of realize that actually a lot of this stuff that's been there all the time, and has adapted sort of unseen, because people don't look. And people tend to think, and let me ask you that question, people tend to think that urban wildlife still is about pigeons and house sparrows and maybe a few parakeets now. Do you find that is the thinking on the street, as it were, from people who are not involved in the conservation sector?
Yeah, 100%. And it's one of the big reasons that I wanted to write the book, actually. And when I first started telling people I was writing a book about urban wildlife, mostly the responses were just what you said. Oh, so pigeons and squirrels and that kind of thing. I don't want to be too highbrow, but at the beginning of my book, I've got a quote from Shakespeare's Coriolanus, what is the city but the people, which I really enjoy. And I think it kind of sums it up. But yeah, like you say, I mean, when I wrote the book, I wanted it to be about those creatures that people expect to find in the city. So I wanted it to be about pigeons and squirrels and rats and foxes, and why they're worthy of our interest, because they're fascinating. But I also wanted to open people's eyes to everything else that you can find in the city, like you did with me, David. Actually, I remember you talking about seeing a honey buzzard from a tower block, the top of a tower block in Liverpool Street. And that idea that you always share that anything can turn up, which I think is absolutely true. So, you know, in my book, I went and found all kinds of things that people don't expect to find in cities. So even, I mean, I'm sure everyone here knows that you can find peregrine falcons in cities, but most people don't know that at all. So when I told friends that I was going to find peregrines, they thought that I was talking about the Harris hawks that the pest controllers fly around the city. They couldn't believe that we had raptors kind of hunting from our tower blocks in our cities. So things like peregrines, water voles in Glasgow, which were one of my absolute favourites. Great crested newts in Peterborough. Peterborough has the largest population of great crested newts probably in the world. So all kinds of things that people might not expect to find.
Why has Peterborough such a large number of great crested newts?
Good question.
Without a spoiler alert here, in case you know you need to read the book.
Yeah, no, it's no spoiler, but there is a reserve on the outskirts. Well, it's basically an island now. It's sandwiched between housing estates and roads. It's owned by Froglife, and it's a former brickworks, so it's a man-made site as well, and it is just teeming with great crested newts. Yeah, they're protected there within the reserve, but like I say, they've been kind of blocked off. Ironically, they built this massive highway that they called Nature's Way along the side of it. Allegedly, of course, allegedly the great crested newts all stay within the reserve, except obviously they don't, because who knew that newts could walk?
That's interesting because urban areas often give rise to some large figures in terms of populations. I mean, immediately I think of Serbia and the fact that in urban areas you've got the biggest amount of long-eared owls anywhere in the world, actually in the urban areas and not outside. But why should anyone on the street, so to speak, for want of a better phrase, want to engage with a rat?
I mean, spoiler, I love rats. I had pet rats growing up, and I think they are absolutely fascinating. There is a man who I actually went to New York to meet called Bobby Corrigan, who is known as the rat czar, and he studied them. And for his PhD, he actually lived in a barn full of rats. And slept in there and got to know their ways. But anybody who's spent any amount of time with rats knows how ingenious they are, how adaptable they are. They're obviously one of the most successful mammals on the planet. But also they have the capacity to show altruism. So they will do things to benefit other rats with no expect of any reward. And they have, so they're kind of, I guess, spectrum of behaviors or emotions that feel almost human. And having kept them as pets, you can kind of connect with them in the way that you might a pet dog, for example. So I think that's why I'm so fond of them. Obviously, I don't want them in my house, but actually, I think quite often the problem is that we invite them in. We don't, we're messy. We don't seal our food properly. We don't build our buildings properly to keep creatures like rats out. And then we basically invite them in and kill them in horrible ways. I think we need to look at ourselves a little bit, and maybe question sort of, I guess, why we have these kind of attitudes towards some of these creatures in particular and not others.
Yeah, it's a shame because a rat has such a bad rap, as it were. Just the mention of the word rat, and you already start thinking of something that's not very good. and they are a wild animal, but as you say, it's the fact that we've encouraged them. They too are victims of our excess, like gulls, or what people call seagulls, pigeons, and the like. Um, do you think this book has had an effect on people who are outside of the sphere? I mean, for me, it's so important to talk to people outside of the circle, as it were. Tonight we've got a lovely bunch of people who are, I'm sure, very firm, committed conservationists. But how do we sort of push this message outside of our little world?
Oh, it's so hard, isn't it? You know this firsthand. It's really, really difficult. I mean, obviously, I've tried to kind of go out and talk about it wherever I can. And so another facet of what I do, I end up doing quite a lot of work in politics. So I've tried to put it in the hands of some politicians and that kind of thing as well. And hopefully have a bit of influence that way. But yeah, it is difficult to have that broader appeal. Having said that, I think in the UK, people are really into wildlife on the whole, and people really are quite passionate about nature. So it's more, I think it's not as much hooking people into nature, it's hooking them into urban nature and why they should care about the wildlife specifically on their doorstep, and showing them that there's something here of value. And I think that's a really important point, actually, because I love to travel. I've been to some incredible places. I've been to Borneo and Galapagos and the Amazon, and I'm really, really privileged. But I think we're all really conscious that actually, if we care about biodiversity, we need to think about our carbon footprints. And I think it's really important to show people that you don't have to travel halfway around the world to access nature. You can find it on your doorstep. And if people have that first point of connection, that is essential to getting them to care and to want to protect it. And actually, protecting rhinos on the other side of the world, that is more, is not as tangible. Whereas if you get people to start caring about what's happening right outside their front door, then hopefully they're going to, that'll, I guess, broaden out and get them to care more broadly about biodiversity. I hope, anyway.
Well, yeah, I've got two questions off the back of that. Firstly, you've travelled extensively. How do you find other urbanites' sort of attitude towards wildlife? Because, for example, in Spain, when I talk, well, people tend to think of British people being obsessed with birds and wildlife. And I say, well, yeah, a lot of us are, but then there's a lot that aren't. What's it like elsewhere in the world? When you've been around and spoken to people, or just seeing how people behave towards wildlife?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, some places they just eat it as much as possible. But do you mean so other urban places specifically?
Yeah, well, for example, I've been to many places myself, and I've noticed that some attitudes towards wildlife, that people differ. I mean, some people are really connected. I mean,
Mhm.
I find that in Germany, when I went to Finland as well, those sort of Nordic countries, and maybe, like, as I say, Germany, they have at least, they kind of embrace the idea of forests and stuff like that and nature. But then you go to other places, and it seems as if they're completely and utterly divorced from it. I mean, I've never been to places like Qatar, but it seems as if it's all about opulence,
Mm,
and the streets are just concrete and steel and glass.
mm.
Um, you know, I just wonder, is there a commonality in terms of how people feel to? Are we kind of intrinsically born interested in nature, or is it just some population within the human population? If you know what I'm
Oh,
saying.
that's a very deep philosophical question, isn't it?
But
I
this
mean,
is in conservation. We get into those theories now and again.
I think, I mean, speaking from experience, I think that the lack of connection to nature has a really detrimental effect on people. So if they don't have that connection, and I think on children in particular, and actually there is kind of good evidence, good research and good evidence to back that up. So I think there must be something innate within us. I mean, we are part of it. I think, you know, there's a problem that I guess in this modern world, we divorce ourselves from nature. And you even see it in some of my favorite nature documentaries. Obviously, we all watch them and love them, but, you know, you rarely see people in them. You see wildlife kind of in a bubble or a silo, as if it's separate from us, but that's not the case. We are part of it. We are all one on this planet, without, I guess, sounding too airy-fairy about it. So yeah, I do think there's something innate within us, but you're right. I think there are different attitudes. I mean, if you go to Mumbai, for example, or Delhi, you'll find animals everywhere within the city, kind of living cheek by jowl with people, and there's kind of crossover between domesticated animals and wild animals, and various different attitudes. I think there's a temple somewhere in India that's devoted to rats, and it's filled with rats that they offer kind of offer food and prayers to. I really want to go there, but so yeah, there are different attitudes. And then, like you say, there are those places, I guess, where it's just sort of all gleaming glass. And Qatar, it's a bit ironic because some of those places, like I guess Dubai as well, they're very into their raptors, aren't they? But flying them themselves, as opposed to creating places for them to nest, I guess.
Yeah, because I watched. I mean, I was invited to Qatar a few years ago, but on the proviso that I bigged up how wonderful falconry was, and I said, "Well, see you later. I'm not coming." And I remember watching recently on BBC News, they had a sort of a travel show program, and there was a guy in Qatar, and he was with a guy with a falcon, and they were going on about how great the falcons are, and they fly after pigeons and stuff. And the guy, the interviewer asked the classic question, which I'm sure he had to ask, which was, "Oh, so aren't these birds cared for and looked after?" And the guy was saying, "Yeah, you know, I love it's like part of my family, and when they get to a certain age, I let them free." And I'm thinking, no, because I'm looking at the bird, it's a hybrid, you know, it's not even and it's not even supposed to be found there. Do you know what I'm saying? And you know, for example, there's apparently a ton of these birds living in Scotland at the moment. You know, falconers just release their birds into the wild thinking, "Oh, that's it, you know, I'm doing my bit for nature." So there is so much education required. And my big bugbear, which a lot of the Zoomers here will know about and probably, you know, be going, "Oh, here he goes again." But I really do feel strongly about the way that nature is portrayed to us. And you touched on it earlier, saying that, you know, you get all these wonderful programs, but it's all about, you know, these animals, and there's not a human or any kind of sign of humanity in sight. And you kind of then are left thinking, so there must be these bubbles of places, you know, where it's all great, and I don't have to worry about throwing my crisp bag in the river because it's actually fine over there. How do you think we should be addressing this? You're a filmmaker yourself, so how do you think we should be addressing this?
Well, I think we need to show. I think we need to show wildlife and people, and I think we need to be clear that we're all part of this. And yeah, the kind of throwing your crisp packet and not having an impact thing. I mean, I think it's a real misconception that there is pretty much anywhere left on this planet that doesn't have human footprints all over it. We've had an impact everywhere, and even if there are those tiny spots where we might not have been, you've impacted the climate and continue to do so. So the idea that you can separate anything from kind of human intervention is mad. And you know, as you know, one of my bugbears is that people have this idea of the countryside in the UK, and they think that the countryside is where nature is. Well, I grew up in, I guess, semi-rural North Essex, which is kind of the countryside. And there were some amazing wildlife spots, don't get me wrong, but people think of all these fields of monoculture, which are effectively wildlife biodiversity deserts. There's nothing there. You'll find a lot more up on Hampstead Heath. So, you know, there's huge misconceptions about what the countryside is. And I think a lot of that is, and I don't want to kind of ruffle any feathers here, but I do think that's partly tied up with the sort of fetishization of farming and agriculture that we have in this country as well. And don't get me wrong, farming is incredibly important, and, you know, food security is incredibly important. But I do think that sometimes we have this kind of idea in our head of something that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, because, you know, the countryside, yeah, as you say, I mean, I often get asked questions, you know, by journalists about what's the difference between watching birds in an urban area and the countryside. And I'm thinking, well, what do you mean by the countryside? You know, number one. And number two, there's this whole thing about, as you said, you have to be in the countryside to enjoy nature, or that's the only way you need to, you know, you can only kind of get in touch in nature by being in the countryside. And it just frustrates me so much, because I'm thinking, yeah, but, you know, the countryside's outside your front door. We are actually in countryside, we just happen to have buildings all over the place and stuff like that, but it's actually part of the greater world, as you say. And I find it frustrating because, you know, you got these people making wildlife programs, and I just watch them and think, you just don't get it. You don't see, you know, you're just going along with this sort of this script that's been written, you know, back in the 50s, which hasn't really changed, you know. And I don't know, bang my head against the wall. That's why reading your book made me feel as if I wasn't alone.
You're not.
It's interesting because I looked at your bibliography, and it's interesting because I've always felt that there's been very few books on urban wildlife until the 2000s. Did you find that?
Yeah. I mean, I looked for everything that was out there, but everything that's been published is fairly recent. I guess before that, where it was a Wild West, people didn't really care. No, some people did care, actually. I met some really amazing people when I was working on my book. And I should say that my book is very much about people as well as wildlife. And that was really important for me, you know, because of what we've just discussed, but also it's about the people who kind of care about urban wildlife, who want to protect it, who work with it, who were generous enough to take me out and show me their patch, as it were, or the urban wildlife that they work with. And so there are some people who have been working on this for a long time. Matthew Frith, for example, from the London Wildlife Trust, or Dusty Gedge, who inspired me to get my green roof, and used to go around looking for black redstarts when they were one of the only protected species, and shutting down building sites until they put mitigation in place across the city. And those early those early founders of the London Wildlife Trust as well, who were quite visionary when no one else was listening. But as you say, there wasn't much interest until relatively recently. So, yeah.
Yeah, and also you, in your book, you talk about Dan Raven. What's his name? Dan
Raven Ellison. Yeah.
Yeah, because he was the driving force, or I presume the driving force in the London London National City Park. Is that right?
National Park City, I think.
Yeah, I always get it wrong in terms of the order. Do you know what's happening with that at all? I know it was granted that sort of status, but what's happened since? Was it just been a symbolic thing, or has anything sort of have come from this?
Good question. I think that it's been quite a symbolic thing. I think other cities are kind of pushing to follow suit. But I think
before you answer, could you actually quickly explain what the premise of this idea was for those who?
Yeah. So Dan's a geographer, and he had a little project to visit every national park in the UK, I think within the space of a year. Was it a year or 6 months? And he did that. And then he had this thought, why isn't London a national park city? We have so much here in terms of habitats. We've got so many species recorded. Why couldn't a city be recognized as a national park too, and mapped as such? And could we have ranges, and this idea about seeing the city differently? And so it was granted by Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. And I guess, although it is perhaps mainly symbolic, that symbolism has had a big impact. And if you hear Sadiq Khan talking about nature within the city and about urban wildlife, he does actually care about these things, I would say. And I'm not sure that you heard mayors talking in that sort of way in the past, except, to be fair, Ken Livingstone, who was one of the first people to start talking about urban wildlife as well. I think he's into his newts, isn't he?
Okay. In your book, you also you talked about Matthew Frith, who's a big hero of mine. Love the man. In fact, for those who don't know, Matthew Frith, I think he's the director of conservation for London Wildlife Trust now, or something like that. But when I first met him, he used to have a hairstyle pretty similar to Paul Weller.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
He's a musician, but he had a Paul Weller hairstyle. I remember he was giving a talk. I was speaking at DEFRA, and I was one of the speakers there, and he spoke first, and then it was my turn, and I said it was really great to be the warm-up act for the Jam, and he wasn't amused by that. But from that point on, we became very good friends, and I think very highly of him. But you mentioned in your book you met with a lady I also know called Alison Fury. And she's just absolutely bonkers about bats. And I'm really quite fascinated about bats in urban areas because, I don't know too much. I remember filming for the BBC about bats in, I think, Manchester, and we had bat detectors, and it's quite fascinating to suddenly realize that there's actually several species of bats flying around that you never even have thought about because, you can't see them. Tell me about your experience with bats and Alison.
Oh, Alison is just amazing. Alison took me to the Cambridge Road estate, which is, I know we're talking a lot about London here, when actually I travelled across the UK for the book, but anyway, this is London. But Alison took me to the Cambridge Road estate in Kingston. And the Cambridge Road estate is notorious. So it's a large council estate with a lot of alleyways, which were built as sort of arteries designed in a nice way to kind of connect different parts of the estate on foot without traffic, so people could get to know each other and walk around. But the reality is that they became a refuge for drug dealing and various difficult things, and there were stabbings on the estate, and it's got quite a difficult past. And it's actually been used it was used recently in the BBC drama The Capture, actually, so it's been used in a fair few crime dramas. But it's also full of bats. and it's due to be demolished. It's due to be demolished and rebuilt with sort of, I guess, shiny new accommodation, as it were. But what they have planned is not very good for bats or for wildlife at all. And Alison has been making it her mission to go around and prove that there are bats there and argue with the council that they should be doing more for wildlife. So she took me around this estate. And one of my favorite things is, so Alison is moving towards her senior years, and she's quite a slight woman, and we're walking down these dark alleyways with the bat detectors out, and she's like, we need to be really careful, we don't want to startle anyone, we don't want to spook anyone. I just love the idea that the residents are going to be terrified by the sight of little Alison walking around with her bat detector. I found it really charming. But she's absolutely brilliant, and I think we need more people like Alison. So she said to me, I won't even walk past a traffic cone without picking it up to see if there's a field mouse lurking underneath. And that's the sort of person that she is. And when I went down a second time, because she'd found a bunch of slow worms nearby, And what had happened was that Alison had seen that some of the sort of mats they put down for ecological surveys had gone down in this area. And Alison didn't think they did a good enough job of this ecological survey. So she went back and put down mats of her own and proved that there was a very large, well, a kind of good medium-sized population of slow worms in this area, and of course put into the council who were planning to develop it and said, you know, you need to put slow worm mitigation in place. So she's a constant thorn in the council's side, but she really made me think, you know, if we didn't have people like Alison, no one would know that these things were there. No one would have ever known that that population of slow worms was there, and then it would have probably been wiped out. And that would be it. We never knew it existed, and then it would be gone. So people like Alison are really, really important. And yes, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, haven't I? Because you wanted to talk specifically about bats.
Well, actually, Alison, as I say, she's a bit of a hero, because I remember I was with her in Kensal Green Cemetery in the middle of the night, and we're walking around the gravestones looking for bats, which is fine. But then we came to a crypt, and she said, "Right, I've got the keys. We're going to go inside this crypt." And I'm like, "But it's like, you know, after dark." And I went down there, and there was some of the coffins with the lids slightly open. I was thinking, and then she started spooking me by talking about people going down in the what's it called, the Lesage, the Parisian
Oh, the
big,
catacombs.
yeah,
Yeah.
and being lost for weeks or whatever, walking around there. And I'm like, Alison, do we need to be down there? There's no bats here. Let's go. You know. Yeah. But anyway, bats. Back to
Bats.
bats.
Lots of bats. I mean, pipistrelles in particular, and I'm pretty certain I haven't got a bat detector out on my estate, but I'm pretty sure we've got common pipistrelles here. Soprano pipistrelles were thought to be the same species for quite some time, and then they discovered that they're separate species. They're slightly smaller, and they have a higher pitched echolocation, as their name suggests. But we found common pipistrelles and soprano pipistrelles on at the Cambridge Road estate. But these bats, common pipistrelles, are commensals. So they live with us just like house mice have evolved to live with us, and they use our structures. So people seem surprised that you get lots of bats in urban environments, but actually some of these species have been living alongside us since, well, as long as we've been living in settlements.
But you always think that bats need pitch black, don't they? But what do they need to survive in an urban area?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why some species do better in urban environments than others. So pipistrelles have a higher tolerance of light. In fact, the ones in my estate have learned to forage around the street lamps, which aren't too bright in this estate, I would say, but they can tolerate higher lights. Whereas I also went to Dudley to a former canal tunnel, which is full of Dorbenton's bats. There's a big roost there, and Dorbenton's bats can cope with a certain amount of light, but nowhere near as much as the pipistrelles. So you'll find them in urban areas, like where I was along this kind of bit stretch of canal and canal tunnel, but only in the darker areas. And actually Morgan, who I went out looking for bats with in Dudley, she's done research looking at where bats might cross and where they might not. So you might end up, if you've got a well-lit area, for example, you might end up with almost like a bat no-go zone, like a force field, and where the bats will turn back around again. So yeah, it depends on the species.
What do you think? What do you think the future holds for our urban wildlife? I mean, I don't know, it's hard to tell really, but what do you think the future is? Do you think that, given the fact that we have this climate catastrophe heading our way, do you think that people will begin to realize that actually we do need to have wild spaces within our urban areas? Or do you think that they'll become, you know, even more sterile, and we'll have this partition in our head that, you know, it's urban and then there's wildlife outside of urban areas. Do you think that we'll ever kind of learn, or do you think it's going to, what do you think? What's your thoughts?
Look, I'm an optimist, and I'm going to cling on to that optimism for as long as I live, because it's how I choose to be. I mean, I think, and it is hard to be an optimist in these days, I would say. It's getting harder and harder. But having said that, I think, you know, we have at least a certain amount of control over the future for urban wildlife. It's kind of up to us. Towards the end of my book, I tried to imagine what our cities might look like if we devoted more space over to wildlife, if we created green roofs on the top of every building, if we thought about vertical planting and thought about every kind of space and dimension. Also things like, which might sound a bit sci-fi, but if we move to electric autonomous vehicles and people didn't have their own cars anymore, and you had autonomous vehicles kind of moving around as and when people needed them, picking people up, taking them to their location, dropping them off, then you wouldn't need all these spaces for parking cars anymore. So could you turn car parks over to wild spaces? Could you get rid of driveways and that kind of thing? Could you think about sustainable and urban drainage solutions? So they're doing some great work in Glasgow where they're combining urban drainage solutions with creating wet habitats to help species there, like the water voles. So are there those kind of things that you could be doing? There's tons of stuff that we could do. It's whether we have the will to do it. I hope that we do, and I think we just have to keep talking about it and spreading the message, don't we? And hoping. I've got my little green roof now, and you know, hopefully people might see it if or listen to me banging on about it and think, oh, maybe I could have one of those too, because actually it's a perfect example of something that benefits wildlife and us. I've got a 7-month-old baby, and he already, when I've got him on his changing table, he looks out of the window of his nursery and he sees that green roof. And do you know, actually, when you were talking about, is there something innate within us? I feel that even more after having had a baby, because he is obsessed with trees. And from when he was really young, and, you know, wasn't as engaged with everything as he is now, he always looked at greenery and at trees, like he looked up at them and he stared, and it calmed him. And you know, there's definitely something in there, there's something within him that connects with that. So yeah, I hope that the future is green and blue, because blue spaces are really important too, but we'll have to see.
One thing I admire about you, Florence, is the fact that you are always striving to do stuff, always working on things, always in the background doing things. You know, you're not one of these people who kind of just mentions something now and again and then doesn't do anything. You actually are committed to what you do. And I think one of the first things, I mean, when I met you initially, you were talking about your birdsong recognition app and citizen science project called Warbler. How is that going? And for those who don't know what Warbler is, what is Warbler?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've got this in common, David, but once I get something in my head, I will make it happen, and I will not stop once I get a bee in my bonnet. But Warbler, so Warbler is the birdsong recognition app. So essentially, if you hear a bird singing and you record it with Warbler, Warbler will tell you what species it is. And I developed it with my co-founder, Dr. Dan Stowell, who is one of the leading scientists in the world working in machine learning and using machine learning to recognize birdsong. The technology, when we first put it out there, was imperfect. It still is, actually. It's a very fresh and developing field. So it's always a bit risky putting a piece of technology out like that, and we try to be kind of transparent with it. So if you record a bird with it, it will give you a list, a percentage for how sure it is, and it will give you a list of species. And that should also mean that if you've got multiple birds in the recording, it's got a better chance of picking them up as well by giving this weighted list of results. And then hopefully people can then kind of click through and look at the different species in that list as well and go, oh yeah, no, that's correct, it was this one, because there's the image and that's what I saw, or there's the recording, that's what I heard. So, but we did have some unexpected results when putting it out. So a surprising number of people, and I don't know why we didn't think about this, but a surprising number of people submit recordings of themselves pretending to be birds. It struggles with those because people don't do very good impressions. But I know this because, like you say, it's also a citizen science project. So every recording that people submit goes to our database, and then Dan's used that for research. He's made it available to various scientists and organizations for research. So we have been through the recordings, not all of them because there are thousands upon thousands of them, but yeah, there's a surprising number of people squawking.
I just don't get that. I don't understand why would anyone want to do that. So that's good. So that's Warbler. In your book, you talk about a manifesto for urban wildlife. Can you kind of give us a couple of bullet points in your manifesto?
Yeah. So I wanted to have something tangible in the book, that people could take away and things that they could go and do. So one of the ones that I'm really passionate about actually is adding water. So if you have a garden, and I know not everyone is privileged enough to have a garden, but if you do, creating a pond, or just a little tub pond will do, but any kind of water within your garden. So I got half a wine barrel because I've got a dog and a cat, so it's not, and a very tiny garden, so it wasn't practical for me to do a proper kind of big sunken pond. But I've got half a wine barrel in my garden, and I've had kingfishers in the kingfishers.
I was about to say, that sounds amazing. Kingfisher in a tiny garden.
Just come
Mind
from
you,
in my head.
having said that, I was my mate had a garden which was basically concrete patio, not a scratch of grass anywhere, not a stitch of grass anywhere. Yet I had, in that little tiny concrete area in Notting Hill in West London, I had a grey wagtail one day just walking around in this patio. And another day, because he had little football pitches, little football goals, we used to play football in the back garden. I looked through the window one day, and there sat on the actual football goal was a wheat ear, and plus
Wow.
a black red star in there as well. So I mean, anything could turn up anywhere at any time.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to blame that on my baby waking me up last night and Sean's picture of the kingfisher looking up at me. Although, of course, I have seen kingfishers in London along the canal a number of times, which is not so far from where I live. But no kingfishers. I have had I've had dragonflies visiting and actually breeding in the pond, so like little nymphs, which is really exciting. So breeding insects. I've got lots of birds that stop there to drink from the water, bees as well, solitary bees nipping down and having a little drink. So it's not big enough for amphibians to breed in, but it has an impact. And obviously if you do have more space, then creating a bigger pond. I grew up with a big pond in my garden, and I used to spend hours gazing into it as a child. So that's a big one. Also, again, if you've got a garden, but just having as much green as possible, doing things like no mow May, no astroturf. That fake grass stuff needs to be banned.
Totally. I mean, I just don't. Why? I mean, I just don't understand that mentality to have that rubbish in your back garden.
It's terrible. And then people use all these chemicals to clean it. So none of that. I'm thinking because our building work has destroyed our lawn.
Like, Sorry, can I interrupt you? Sorry, I just had this thought. I was watching a quiz show the other day, and the host says, "So, if you won today, what would you spend your money on?" He said, "Oh, I'd like to buy an astroturf for my lawn, for my back garden, astroturf lawn." And I thought to myself, "I want you to lose. You need to lose." Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just saying that our lawn was destroyed by the building work, so I'm thinking of putting a clover lawn in. But I think also just generally being quite a messy gardener, so this idea that everything must be pruned and manicured is not good for nature. And you know, we need to promote the idea that, I guess, wilder spaces, or what people might think of as overgrown spaces, are a good thing. You know, throughout cities, if we left, I call them incidental plants in this book, but weeds, if you like, if we left more of them to grow, then that would have a benefit on air pollution, food for pollinators, seeds for birds. So, you know, there are things that we can do by not really doing much at all as well. So yeah, that's a big one. And ditching weed killer, obviously. Building better, we talked about rats getting into people's houses and into buildings because we don't build properly, so building better as well. Planting on different planes, so like my green roof, reducing light pollution if possible. And you know, this is a difficult one because I understand that our streets in our urban areas need to be lit for safety reasons, but these super bright white LED bulbs are really bad for wildlife. So those warmer lights are at least a bit better for bats in particular, but you'd know more than me, David, but for birds too, I think. So yeah, that's just a few things, and raising awareness, going out and talking to people about this as much as possible, which obviously we both try and do.
Yeah,
that's just a few of the points. There's
but
50.
but do you? I don't know. Money talks, isn't it? People are more interested in profit, aren't they?
Yes, some people, not all people. But yeah, it's a problem, particularly when it comes to development, for sure.
What's next? Talking about development. What are you working on next? What's your next thing now?
So
I know you're always working on stuff. I know you.
of course. I'm working on a proposal for what I hope will be my next book, which is hopefully a sort of natural follow-on in some ways from Wild City. So yeah, I'm working on that, and then working on an idea for a children's book as well, which is exciting because I've got a little one now and I love reading to him. So yeah, those are kind of the main things in the pipeline.
Well, that sounds pretty exciting. You know, we've covered quite a lot of stuff tonight, actually, and I think the whole idea of urban nature is becoming so much more in the conversation these days. I remember when I first, 16 years ago, first started talking about it. I know there was other people talking about it. In fact, the most original of the urban birders was talking about it back in the late 1800s. W.H. Hudson, who's going to be a subject of another In Conservation With in the future. But you know, people are talking about it more, and I'm really, really delighted. And I think that your book is going to go a long way to get people really engaged. And I think also the fact that, you know, I think people who are not necessarily within our circle will be picking this book up to actually read. So, you know, congratulations on putting this together.
Thank you. Well, you know, I was too at a very large part inspired by you, David, and you know, you taught me a lot, and obviously you feature in the book, but also you really made me look at our cities differently too. So, you know, I'm very grateful to you for that.
Thank you, Florence. If you could be anywhere in the world, Florence, right this very moment, where would you be?
You know what? Although there's a part of me that wants to say Galapagos, I am going to say on Hampstead Heath. Maybe not right now because it's dark and you don't really want to be up there in the dark, let's be honest. But it really is my my favorite place to be, and in the autumn it's absolutely beautiful, with all the leaves falling from the trees and all the different colors, and yeah, when I go up there, I just feel this weight lifted off my shoulders, and yeah, I love being there.
You know, I don't really know Hampstead Heath that well, you know.
Wow, you should spend more time up there. It's a very special place. Yeah, I was actually born in the Royal Free Hospital, which almost overlooks it. So I feel like I'm kind of rooted there.
Yeah, you got a connection, absolutely. What is your favorite organism?
Now I'm really struggling with this one because you know me, I'm really interested in everything. And you know, I was thinking, I was thinking of the things that I enjoyed the most, looking for in my book. So I was thinking of the newts, the great crested newts. I was thinking of the water voles, and and then I thought of my baby, who is also an organism, and I thought maybe I ought to pick him, de facto. But I've decided that I'm going to go for the brown rat, because I am on a bit of a PR drive right now, and I don't think anyone else is going to pick it, so I am.
Well, I must say, on in conservation with you are the very first, and I'm sure maybe maybe the only one ever. Anyway, no disrespect to rats, of course.
I mean, you know, they cause a lot of conservation issues, they do, but they also have a lot going for them.
Okay. Now, I oh good. I just heard the doorbell ring. I want to quickly tell you Zoomers what's happening coming up in the next the next 3 or 4 Zooms. This on the 1st of December, this Thursday, we got the great birding guru, Killian Malani, who's one of the guys behind the Birders Bible, the Collins Guide, and the 3rd edition is coming out. And it's the book that if I was a kid now, I'll be going to bed with every night under my pillow. I mean, it's just an amazing book. And he's an incredible artist and a fabulous bird. I mean, when I was speaking to him today as a prelim, you know, before our meeting, I had to sort of get pictures out and say, "Oh, Killian, what's this bird? What's that?" You know, he's the Bible. So on Thursday, the 1st of December, Killian Malani, and basically what we're going to be doing is, if you've got any images of birds that you don't recognise, he's the man to talk to. So please submit them, and maybe we'll feature them in the actual program itself. On the 5th of December, we've got Professor Frank Rennie, and he's talking about the secret life of the corncrake. On the 12th of December, Connor Jameson, and he's talking about the naturalist and the original urban birder, as far as I'm concerned, W.H. Hudson. And on January the 9th, we've got Mike Unwin, and he's talking about going around the world in 80 birds. And we've got a ton more people coming up. So please keep an eye out online on the website, because people are always being added on every 5 seconds, it seems. And I'm really happy that we've had Florence tonight. Long overdue, if you ask me, Florence. But thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts on urban wildlife. And don't forget, guys, this is a book to get, okay? If you're watching this in the future and it's not in your bookshelf, go and buy it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Zoomers, once again, thank you for being here tonight and supporting In Conservation With. Really appreciate your being here, basically. So don't forget, have a good time in your life and keep looking up.